Hello again. Today I want to explore something I refer to as the dilemma of excess resources, a sort of problem that presents itself when individuals or groups are faced with a sudden or gradual excess of resources they don't know what to do with. I find it an interesting concept to explore because I think it to be the reason that corporate bureaucracy has grown to such a needlessly massive scale, with human resources departments bloating to consume much more of the pie than is really necessary. And we're seeing this in our educational institutions in Canada, in which the administrative departments endlessly assert their dominance and control over the actual teachers and professors in the school. The freedom an individual teacher has in teaching their course eventually dwindles from the repressive regulation imposed on the teacher by the admin. Talk to anybody who teaches for a living, and the biggest complaint they'll have about the job is the retarded admin they have to deal with day by day. Oftentimes, what we dislike most about a certain endeavor is not the endeavor itself, but its associated traits or givens, as it were. Like what is a given when you're dealing with this profession? Sure, if it's a shit area, the students will be a pain to manage as well. But as a whole, the difficulty of the profession comes in the form of interpersonal relationships with admin that may or may not be power hungry or, you know, obnoxious, we'll say. But that is all besides the point. What we are seeing is certain parts of institutions expanding their influence in order to more effectively grab at extra resources whenever they show up. This occurs despite these constituent parts not needing extra funding, like an adequately funded human resources sector gobbling up funding that would have otherwise had better utility being used elsewhere. Ultimately, the dilemma is as follows. Occasionally, there are more resources than are necessary for the continued functioning of a given system, so there's an excess. What is to be done with these resources becomes disputed among competing parties who all stand to gain from having more resources. Everyone benefits from getting more funding. Right? They get more freedom. Think of a big family having a feast. When there's more food on the table than the family members believe is necessary for everyone to be full, some people get a little more handsy. They take portions bigger than they otherwise would have, and they might be prone to overeating. Surely, eating more than I should won't harm anyone, considering there's more than enough food to go around. That's the mindset. But what this perspective does is to bias the interests of the individuals in the system that are more willing to harvest excess resources. It biases their interests over the interests of other members. So the people who are more comfortable with just eating more food at a time in which they believe everyone is fine, they get more. You may then be able to deduce how this may become a problem when there's an expected balance within these systems, or when perhaps an individual in the system has an existing deficit that needs replenishing. What happens when someone's hungry, or everyone is supposed to have the same amount for whatever reason? It works less with the food analogy and more with money. Oftentimes, projects and work will be funded initially, but when the time comes for the second round of funding, there's no follow-through and shit doesn't get done long-term. You can imagine how this hemorrhages money and effort while simultaneously allowing people like politicians to claim that they're getting things done when they really aren't. They're busy sending that money that could otherwise be used to better effect into their pockets or those of their friends or for their own interests rather than the interests of the people they are chosen to represent. But here's the kicker. It doesn't seem like a problem because they say or the thought process behind it is that there's loads of funding to go around. But when you have existing commitments that you need to chuck that funding into, shit starts to get a little shaky. This dilemma that I'm trying to explain, and I'm doing a very poor job of it, takes center stage when we look at Africa, for instance, the main exemplar of the point I'm trying to make, and a baffling collection of many misfortunes. Now, there is a generally racist or racist-leaning argument on why Africa as a nation hasn't developed nearly as much as would be expected to, given its history of human and pre-human presence, and it's a pretty weak premise. The gist is that because their primary population is black people, it's mostly black people in Africa, they were thus unable to develop beyond certain stages of civilization by virtue of black people's blackness, or their race as it were. Because of their intrinsic race, they are not able to develop. Which is... it's something. That's you see it a lot online. I think it falls flat when you consider the other possibilities for why that could be the case, beyond this one simple conclusion drawn from very flawed premises, And if you also consider that every single person has descended from a black person, it kind of falls flat as well. Because we were all the same thing at one point. Africa, in and of itself, is known for having some pretty miserable geography. Huge deserts and savannas, coupled with dense jungles and fauna around the equator. It's no surprise that transporting materials, especially across Africa's interior, becomes more difficult. And this initial guess is actually pretty accurate to why a lot of at least the middle of Africa isn't developed, especially given the size of the continent. But what I believe has played a part as well is the subject of this video, this very crisis of resources. Because Africa just so happens to be very, very rich in natural resources that are valued very highly by the world. Metaphorically speaking, on a material basis alone, they have a table with a bunch of food on it, a lot of food. Food other people want for themselves and their own development, we'll say. Now what happens when these other people start to take for themselves? Well, it leaves less food for the people actually seated at that table. And the methods they've used are rather destructive, to say the least. Cutting deals with local leaders and their ilk, who are willing to sell out their people's resources for a cut of the profit, ends up damaging the area's ability to be self-sufficient, because everyone starts to rely on the infrastructure of the colonizer, we'll say. Project this out a few decades, and it shouldn't be surprising at all that much of Africa is an underdeveloped shithole. Now, I don't entirely buy the colonialist narrative, but it is so reductive and idiotic, because I see this so much, and it is like mind-boggling. It is so stupid to pin the blame on black people by virtue of their skin color or their ethnicity, when the problem is and has been people to begin with interfering with the development. It's their greed. They want to eat more of what's good, right? We have a big table and a big feast on the table. They want more food. Everyone does. They want to accrue more of what they value. There's a select few that doesn't and is content, but people as a whole are animals. We are the civilized animal that has convinced ourselves of our own autonomy, or at the very least, of our status as more than beasts. The very reason there is a correlation with these kinds of events, I noticed, is because people sometimes go out of their way to reap resources that aren't theirs to reap, or take too much out of the flawed assumption that everyone has enough, and that it won't hurt others to take more than you should. Things seem to be striving towards balance of some form. Things, in general, work better when there's a healthy medium between conflicting interests. Skewing this balance is what then causes issues. In our educational institutions, from a Western perspective at least, this balancing occurs with government funding in various sectors of the institution that have to share this funding amongst themselves. When this balance skews, it typically skews in the favor of the administration. My guess is that the teachers are more concerned with actually doing their jobs than taking more than they should, but the result is an oppressive and domineering admin that produces counterproductive rules and restrictions designed for either no one's benefit at all or the benefit of a few at the expense of others. They take so much resources that they give themselves a reason to just, dig their claws deeper because, we have all this funding, we are now more important. That's the thought process behind it. And then in Africa, from my perspective and understanding, which is, again, likely to be inaccurate in some way, this balancing occurs with natural resources, whomever is permitted to harvest these natural resources and for whose benefit. When this balance skewed, historically, and still now really, in the favor of companies that are, forgot the term, that are not based in Africa. So we have like foreign companies coming into Africa. The only profits that were generated were for other nations. It was extracting profit out of Africa and into other countries, which starves the host country of the profits it otherwise should have reaped from material harvesting. And the result that we are seeing today is that the vast majority of that continent is underdeveloped for how long we've been there, despite numerous places in which resources are extracted, which do typically increase quality of living in the area. Like they're pulling value out, and so it shouldn't really be surprising that there is not as much value to go around in that area and develop the infrastructure there. And poorer countries, I think as a whole, typically don't have to manage the ever-expanding bureaucracy of more developed nations, but to compensate for that struggle, they are plagued with more blatantly self-interested and corrupt leaders, the likes of which are frequently used as pawns in larger geopolitical, profit-motivated plans. It's happening in Africa, where you have like local leaders just shilling to big companies and and they get a cut of the profit, and them and their friends are, and their friends and their families are nice and well fed and very prosperous, but it doesn't help the people. The people always suffer. How can anyone who sees this scale as a whole pin the blame of the scale's consequences on individuals simply based on their skin color? They don't. They don't quite see the scale. Look at surface level and there will be correlations. There always will be. But just as soon as you find these correlations, you will also see counterexamples at some point in history. It is then up to the individual to generate a worldview that reconciles both contradictory observations. It is this process that I believe is critical thinking. The message this video intended to send is just a vehicle for this meta message, I believe. I really think we need these meta narratives woven through in order to improve public discourse, because it is unproductive and largely a waste of time, as it is now, to see a correlation and then not to think a little more deeply as to why that would be the case. It's taking things one step further beyond why is X people doing Y more frequently than Z people. Alright, because there's so much more to it than the surface level. We could be better. We could do this a lot better and get a lot more productive discourse out there. That's about it. Thank you for watching.